Hello, this is Joe Trahan, welcoming you to the All Me podcast from the Taylor Hooton Foundation, whose mission is to enlighten the world to the truths about appearance and performance-enhancing substances. As the national leader on this subject, they communicate their educational messages through various methods, including this podcast. Thank you for listening and enjoy the show.
Welcome to episode 2 of the All Me podcast. This is your host, Don Hooton Jr., and in this episode, we're going to pick up where we left off in episode 1. So if you haven't had a chance to listen to episode 1 yet, I'm going to encourage you to hit stop, go back, take a listen to episode 1, and join us here in episode 2 when a local news station writes an article about Taylor's story that goes viral nationally. Little did we know at the time, but this article will be picked up by media outlets nationwide, including the New York Times and CBS 60 Minutes. You're also going to hear Senior talking about participating in the 2005 congressional hearings with Major League Baseball and the phone call that he received at his house from Commissioner Bud Selig. Be sure to subscribe to the All Me podcast, and thank you for listening.
I want to go back to something that you said, because you had mentioned doctors along the way and the doctor being there at the first program to kind of back up what you were getting ready to present to the parents. But what I think listeners need to hear and understand, and they're going to hear this in future podcasts, is we have doctors and experts that are lined up to discuss this topic, is even today, many doctors are simply not trained on how to address this problem if a patient's to come into their office. It was one of Taylor's doctors who at the time felt he just would quit cold turkey, and that was the recommendation I believe he was given, is just to stop the use of anabolic steroids right there. That was ultimately the prescription for his death, which could really set off the depression. So one of the things that we're going to do in future episodes, and one of the reasons you'll want to subscribe to the podcast, is we are going to have doctors on talking about the need for more medical education. So I'm glad you brought that up. So following the delivery of the first program, and I remember having the early discussions in our kitchen, what was it like setting up the Taylor Hooton Foundation? What was your intent when we got together as a family saying, hey, we need to form the Taylor Hooton Foundation. We need to share Taylor's story and be the voice of this problem?
Well, one of the experts who is since deceased, but one of the experts that I became very close with was a doctor out of NYU, New York University Medical School. His name was Dr. Gary Wadler. Dr. Wadler was not only an expert on anabolic steroids, but performance-enhancing drugs at the time, was chairman of the Banned Substance Committee for the World Anti-Doping Agency. And what that means is he was chairing a panel that was overseeing the testing of old drugs and new drugs and deciding what drugs would not be allowed in the Olympics in particular. But of course, those rules find their way out into all sports worldwide. And he became a shoulder that I could lean on. He spent hours with me helping understand what these drugs do and why they're so dangerous. And it was during one of our discussions, and I, of course, after that first presentation and presentations to follow, and the New York Times and Dallas Morning News and CBS 60 Minutes, was expressing a desire that the good Lord had called us to reach out to the nation on this topic. And I don't remember I think it was Dr. Wadler who suggested, he said, Don, well, the best way to make that happen is to form a foundation, a nonprofit organization that people of like mind can support, can contribute to, can help make your dream become a reality. And I talked to a couple of friends. One friend who remains on our board of directors provided the initial funding for us to hire an attorney to draft the initial paperwork and get the foundation formed, to procure approval from the IRS of a nonprofit. And we filed our paperwork in February of 2004, about 6 months after Taylor died, and we got our approval about a year later. And the reason I remember it was a year later, because the paperwork came in the exact day of the now infamous hearings, which we'll talk about, Senate hearings or congressional hearings in Washington on March the 15th of 2005. And being a believer, I just don't believe things like that happen by accident. There's a larger hand at work here. We believe it's our good Lord, and things happen for the right reason. And That was the initial formation of the foundation, and the purpose was and still is raising awareness and educating people so that they can avoid getting themselves and their family and their kids into the kind of situation that almost killed us.
We talked about Taylor passing July 15, 2003. 6 weeks later, you deliver the first program in Plano. Following that, the formation of the Taylor Hooton Foundation takes place. And all the while, I remember CBS 60 Minutes filming, the Dallas Morning News article, the New York Times article. That led to a couple Senate hearings. When did the Senate hearings take place? Why were you there to testify? Who reached out to you? If you could just kind of give people an insight as to what that was like.
It was a whirlwind of activity. After the 60-minute story ran, and there was a story on the front page of the sports section of the New York Times, I've never, ever been through anything like this before. And it just set off a whole flurry of activity. We had every major network in the U.S., things like, trying to remember the name of some of the programs, and some of them don't exist anymore, but the investigative programs on CBS and ABC and NBC, just a number of the networks did special 15 or 30-minute stories on the air. We had international newspapers from all over the world, several from Europe, from Japan. We had a couple of reporters from Japan came over, film crews. It was crazy what was going on. And with all of this activity, it was simultaneous. I mean, what had stirred the interest was a combination of Taylor's tragic death. I would be remiss if I didn't say what was also underpinning the story at the time. This was when the Bash brothers, Sosa and McGuire, the Bash brothers had just finished setting home run records. There were rumors of steroids throughout the news. Jose Canseco was in the mix here, or later Alex Rodriguez. I mean, there were just the biggest names in the biggest sport in the United States, all wrapped up in the steroid story. And simultaneously with that, you had a kid from Plano, Texas, that had a suicide connected with these drugs. It was just a convergence of interest. And along the way, our politicians, who are always never to miss a spotlight, were conducting hearings in Washington basically to dress down baseball on the subject. And we became a good voice to stand alongside the politicians to beat up on Major League Baseball. And went through a couple of hearings. First one was a Senate hearing chaired by, it was Joe Biden, and I'm going to embarrass myself and go blank on his name here. One of the other big senators, he'll come to me in a second. We visited a hearing there and were asked to testify and tell Taylor's story, and it was all in support of some legislation that Joe Biden had been involved in, the Anabolic Steroids Act, and what we had experienced. That was followed up by some House hearings by another committee, much more low-key than the final one, which was to follow, but was an opportunity for us to be able to provide testimony to support the danger of these drugs that were kind of in addition to the cheating scandal, which had been unfolding. And as the Congress folks learned, I was an articulate spokesman for this issue, an emotional, articulate spokesman that had a powerful story to tell, and we became a good prop for those guys. That's okay. Turns out that's what we needed to be used for. And we got invited. One of the staffers, or Henry Waxman, I believe it was, the then chairman or co-chairman of the committee, called to see if I would be willing to come up for a third testimony before the House Oversight Committee, which, just parenthetically, that's the committee that Adam Schiff is running now. You know, these are the guys that are conducting all of the impeachment hearings in Washington. It's a pretty powerful committee, very visible committee, lots of representatives, but they asked me if I would be willing to come up and testify. I remember having to argue with them, not argue, but to appeal to them on who was going to pay my travel expenses, because it's not insignificant to go spend 2 or 3 days in Washington and fly up and back. That was going to be the hearings where they were inviting Major League Baseball to join the ceremony in a set of all-day hearings to dress down baseball, try to uncover how big the problem was. So I prepared, was given 5 minutes to speak, But as the guys there in the hearings on the committee whispered to me, nobody's going to stop you if you go beyond 5 minutes. So I prepared for 10 minutes worth of testimony and got ready to take the show to Washington.
This ultimately is where you're going to testify on a panel just before Jose Canseco, Sammy Sosa, Mark McGuire, Rafael Palmeiro, and Kurt Schilling. And I think people remember watching those hearings. People remember seeing the pictures from those hearings. But one of the things I think people will never forget, and it's something that you said that day, if people haven't heard those hearings, they can go back and listen to your testimony. I'm sure it's out there on YouTube and out on the internet. But one of the things that you said that day is you called the players cowards for being, I quote, afraid to step on the field without the aid of performance-enhancing substances. When you were preparing your speech, was that in there? Was that something you thought about not saying? And was it hard to get through some of those comments because they were very real to you, was very passionate, but I think those were some of the quotes that you said that made the biggest impact that day.
Yeah, Donald, it's interesting that you asked that because I remember sitting in the kitchen of our home in Plano at the time, preparing my remarks, and I went over them and rewrote them and went over them and rewrote them. And I knew that some of the comments that I was preparing were explosive. We called out the players. I called out the management of Major League Baseball. And I remember one of the other lines that I used, you guys, some of you say you don't want to be role models, and challenging the players. You don't have a choice as to whether you're role models or not. You're playing Major League Baseball.
Exactly.
You are a role model, and it has an impact on our children. Taylor looked up to you guys, and Rob Garibaldi, his parents were there as another young man that committed suicide. He had looked up to Barry Bonds. So there were some very, very powerful comments I knew I was making. And I got to tell you, honestly, the morning that I walked into those hearings, and to describe the atmosphere there is just unbelievable to be sitting in there with all of the news people. And those were the most watched hearings in the history of the Congress. Let me say that again. That was the most watched hearings in the history of the Congress. Impeachment hearings in the past, the Waco hearings, everybody will remember those. These were more attention than any other hearings had gotten. And you walk into that room and I'm thinking, holy cow, I knew what was coming. Nobody else did. I had second thoughts, but I'm a trained public speaker. And what I learned a long time ago and have been trained and practiced on is you go with the remarks that you came prepared with. Don't try to sit at that table in front of millions of people and try to adjust. It was very, very tough, but in hindsight, essential that those remarks got made, because what followed that, both from a public perception standpoint and Major League Baseball's activities and other things that happened, it was right on point, and nobody got insulted about it, and some people did some things that I don't think otherwise might have happened.
You're there in that courtroom, I guess, if you will, getting ready to testify, and you have some of the biggest names in Major League Baseball and Major League Baseball management sitting around you. Before or after the testimony, were you able to interact with any of the players or any of Major League Baseball's management?
The players weren't in the room at the time. They were there's a ante room, a private room that's off the floor there that They were in the back. I later learned they were all watching the testimony on TV. Management was there, Bud Selig, Rob Manfred, Bob Dupay, who was then the president of Major League Baseball, Sandy Alderson, and I'll bring up his name again in just a moment. They were all sitting in the room, so they got to hear it firsthand, and the players got to watch it on TV like the rest of America did. And kind of a sidebar, I think when the nation saw McGuire tear up at the table or in the hour that followed, in the panel that followed, we were sitting right behind him. And I personally believe it was some of those words that touched him when he realized, as I hope the other players did, but when Mark, who's a good man, he's a good guy. I've met him and talked to him. He's a good family man. I think for the first time, maybe some of those clowns recognized the connection between their behavior and the death of two young children that were aspiring baseball players with their families sitting immediately behind them that day. It was very, very powerful. I didn't have any interaction with the players, period. I think I've met almost all of them in the intervening time period, in the months and years that followed. And I'd had no interaction with anybody in management other than Sandy Alderson, who was big-time exec working in New York at the time, had been, I believe, with the Oakland Athletics, the president or senior guy out there, and was moved to New York to help Bud Selig run baseball. The hearings went on for about 11 hours, give or take. And at the end of the day, we were all exhausted. It was about 7 o'clock at night or thereabouts. And he came over to introduce himself in this multi-$1,000 suit, big, strong, impressive guy, to introduce himself, express his condolences about our loss of Taylor. But he said, I didn't really appreciate who he was at the time. But he said, Mr. Hooton, I want you to know that today you changed Major League Baseball. We will never be the same again after the message that you delivered here today. And I want you to know that. And as it turned out, Bud Selig and others in senior management at baseball echo the same thing. The way they've approached this problem and others in other sports across America began to change that day at those hearings in the March of 2005.
I can't tell you, just in all of my travels and work that we've done with Major League Baseball and continue to do, how many people in very prominent roles have said that your testimony that day changed Major League Baseball. Not long after the hearings took place, you received a phone call from the commissioner of Major League Baseball at the time, Commissioner Emeritus Bud Selig. Why did he call you? What was it like? What was it like answering the phone? Talk about that.
I think it was 2 days after the hearing, not the next day, but the day after. The reason I know it wasn't the day after, I had to go to New York to do Good Morning America and a couple of other, it was unbelievable time, but to do several other news stories. And when I went into my office 2 days after the hearings, the phone rings and said, Don, this is Bud Selig. Yeah, sure it is. You know, I thought it was somebody calling to play a prank on me, and he continued to try to convince me it was him. And ultimately, as he recalls it, I hung up on him. I don't know whether it was delicately or not, but anyway, he had his secretary call me back and provide me a phone number so I could call in directly to the commissioner's office of Major League Baseball. I began to feel like an idiot at the time, but sure enough, he wanted to talk to me. He had a really, really nice conversation. I can remember many of the words, but the most important ones were, after expressing his condolences and sympathies for our loss, said something like, you know, Don, Major League Baseball has a profound social responsibility to the youth of this country, and we take that responsibility seriously. We'd like to find out what we as Major League Baseball can do to help you in your work. And that set in pace a series of activities. After the phone call, I was put in touch with Bob DuPay, who was at the time the president of Major League Baseball, and worked with he and Rob Manfred, who is now the commissioner of Major League Baseball. He took Bud Selig's place, and we worked together with their executive committee and me and my executive committee, just a couple of guys on my board, including Dr. Wadler. But we put together a proposal for Major League Baseball with a bunch of ideas with how, with their financial support and with their moral support and their organization support, how we could begin to attack this problem together. And we're now 15 years down the road, and the support that Major League Baseball provided us continues. And we're now working with teams and with players, all in an effort. All of it is focused on kids and trying to raise awareness, and now using role models in a real sense, using the finest players and best players in Major League Baseball as examples of how you can make it to the very pinnacle of a very, very tough sport by doing things the right way. And we formed an organization of those players. In fact, I'm so proud as we watch the World Series that's going on this week to see some of our players, our Taylor Hooton Foundation players. We call them our All Me League, but our players out on the field playing in the toughest, best, most visible time of the year for baseball, our guys are out there playing at that level after committing to not using performance-enhancing drugs and acting as role models for the youth of this nation.
It's kind of crazy, to think that at the time you hung up on the commissioner of Major League Baseball. But I know Bud Selig, he came to our inaugural gala. We recognized him with the Taylor's Legacy Award just for all of the support that he has provided over the years. But it sounds like you still talk with Bud Selig today.
Oh, yes. I would say almost friends. Don't have any kind of social relationship with him, but we got a mutual respect. I was warned by a lot of the sports reporters about Major League Baseball's just using you. They're really not interested in solving this problem. And Bud Selig has proved them all wrong. I just had an instinctive liking for Mr. Selig, and I still do. I talk with him semi-regularly. I was in his office in Milwaukee this week talking about the problem and thanking him for the support that he's provided all these years. He's no longer in management of baseball, but as you might imagine, is very influential in sports and out in the business world. And he honestly believes in what we're doing and in the important work that we're doing. It's for that reason that he stepped on board initially, has continued to be with us. And for anyone that reads his brand new book that's out, which just came out, you'll see that he devotes a couple of chapters in his book to the steroid problem in baseball and to the impact that, in part, that we have had with baseball in helping him address this problem. This was a real predicament for he and everybody else in the baseball for a while. And I'd like to believe not only did we help turn that ship around, but provided another platform for Major League Baseball to demonstrate in a positive way that they believe in a positive message on the subject. And what a contrast today, 2019, about the positive messages that they are helping us to deliver to kids about doing things right, playing all me without the use of performance-enhancing substances. And to contrast that to the days when Jose Canseco claimed, yet to be proven, but claimed that over 80% of the players in baseball were juicing and using anabolic steroids. We've come a long way.
No, we have. And thanks to the support from Major League Baseball, we, the Taylor Hooton Foundation, I'm proud to say, have directly impacted over 2 million lives here in the U.S. and millions more worldwide through our website and other online resources. But one of the other guys that I heard recently, we were doing a fundraiser in Washington, D.C. at Nationals Park, and Tom Davis was there, who was there during your testimony. It was interesting to get his perspective from that day. And guy loves baseball, so obviously it's an easy conversation for he and I to have. But one of the things he said that night with all of the guests in the suite was that Don Hooton changed Major League Baseball during those hearings. I think the most important thing here to think about and to know is that Major League Baseball, through the Taylor Hooton Foundation, is responsible for educating and saving lives because of this much-needed education. Going back to 2003 and losing Taylor, did you ever think that because we lost Taylor that so many lives would be changed and so many people around the world would hear his story?
Don, I couldn't have even dreamed at that level. I remember back to that conversation on the porch outside the funeral home with Alan Jordan from our church. I remember expressing it that I said, if we could just get out and deliver a message to the folks here in Dallas and the North Texas area, that was as far as my brain was capable of dreaming at the time. It was inconceivable to think that we could have reached as far as we have. And I credit that to the work of the good Lord. And I'm not going to get preachy on you, just to say that I couldn't have done this alone. We couldn't have done this alone. There's a much bigger force at work here and much more purpose to what we're doing and to our loss of Taylor. Now, from a selfish standpoint, it's been a great healing tool for our family, for me, for you, for Mackenzie, for Mom, to be able to take our loss and talk about it and feel like we're doing something and that Taylor's life and his death have meaning. And by doing that, he's still alive. We get to talk about Taylor every day of our lives. But to answer your direct question, no, had no concept that what we'd walked into was a national problem and that we would be called on and recognized to lead this charge.
It's never easy losing my younger brother, but I know sharing his story with hundreds of thousands of people, it doesn't ever make it easier, but it is therapeutic. It does help. People ask how you do it. I'm like, I do it because I don't want to see this happening to another family. And everybody can reach out and support us. We are a 501c3, so you could contribute through a donation using our website, but we also have many fundraisers that we do here in the North Texas area as well as around the country. So we have a calendar of those events on our website as well, which we'll place in the notes. But outside of education, we believe it's important to inspire people to want to live and compete without the use of drugs. And Senior, I think you've alluded to this and talked about this a few times. So a few years ago, during a conversation I was having with one of our longtime friends and current Taylor Hooton Foundation Board of Director, Doug Heisler, we were thinking about what impactful phrases might encompass what living and competing without the use of appearance and performance enhancing substances might mean. And I'll never forget Doug looking at me and he said, "What about all me?" And something hit me that day because I knew right away that that was something that was going to stick. We went back to the drawing boards and we started making t-shirts and coming up with various phrases. And even today, that's actually a registered trademark of the Taylor Hooton Foundation. And from there, the next step was going to be to find a way to get some celebrity power behind this all me and our positive messaging. And I remember visiting with you and some of the leadership of Major League Baseball. And, we figured there's no better way than putting together an advisory board of current Major League Baseball players. And we thought we'd be really successful after reaching out to all 30 Major League teams that we would have 5 Major League Baseball players that would step forward. I remember that very first spring training. I believe it was back in 2015. We had 13 players that had voluntarily stepped forward. I'm proud to tell you that today we have 40 Major League Baseball players representing all 30 Major League Baseball teams. In fact, you got 2 guys, as you mentioned, that are playing in the World Series. We'll be playing tonight, Josh Reddick from the Houston Astros, and you have Anthony Rendon from the Washington Nationals. So we're so appreciative of their support. But we also have some amazing female athletes who have stepped forward to help us carry our message to females around the world. And if anybody wants to learn more about these athletes, you can visit allmeleague.com or you can come by our website, taylorhooton.org, and we'll put all these in the show notes as well. But wanted to thank everybody for tuning in to the very first episode of the All Me podcast. We hope you'll subscribe to our podcast as we interview professional athletes, sports dietitians, medical doctors, athletic trainers, and so many more experts that are in this field that have a story to tell. And Pop, wanted to thank you for, having this discussion with me today. I think it's really important for people to hear our message and understand what our family went through and why it's our mission at the Taylor Hooton Foundation to enlighten people to the truths about appearance and performance enhancing substance. Thank you for taking your time this morning to talk with me.
Well, that's it for today's show. Thanks for listening to the All Me podcast from the Taylor Hooton Foundation, a nonprofit organization leading a national campaign to enlighten people to the truths about appearance and performance-enhancing substances and inspiring people to live and compete without the use of these substances. Please be sure to subscribe to our podcast and tune in to our next episode.